This is Steve Lawson. Please check out my interview at forbassplayers.only.com.
Steve, it's great to meet you. I've known of you for several years now, and I always thought what you do is kind of cool. So why don't we work up to what you do, but I'd like to start from the beginning. You could tell me about your musical upbringing. How did you grow up musically?
The biggest inspiration starting out was my mum. She's always had a very playful approach to music, so she would play loads of instruments. None of them particularly well, but that wasn't the point. The point was that it was about kind of experimentation and fun, and always accompanying people singing. So as kids, my brother and sister and I all played instruments, and I gravitated towards bass when I was about 13.
Any particular reason you gravitated toward the bass?
Well, my three favourite bands at the time were Tears for Fears, Level 42 and Duran Duran, and in each of those bands the bass player had the best hair. So that was my main reason. But yeah, it was just that it was a great time for bass in pop music. And I moved from London right up to the Scottish border, and a local school teacher was selling a bass for £25, so about $35. And yeah, so I bought it. That was it, and that was me thrown straight in.
Okay. Well, so I was going to ask you who your influences are. I guess we can say Mark King and
the others. Very early on, it was Nick Beggs and Kurt Smith. But then I very quickly started playing in a band that we were trying to do Who tunes and Cream, and then I discovered Chris Squire, and so Yes were a very big formative influence. And it was a lot of it was about where the bass sat within that. But I think the point at which I started to form some kind of aesthetic around what I was doing was hearing Joni Mitchell. So maybe 7 or 8 years before I actually started playing solo properly, that actually what I heard in Joni's music was like, well, that's what I want to make. That's how I want music to make me feel. I want to make music that makes me feel the way that music makes me feel. So it wasn't so much Jacko, because I wasn't playing fretless at the time. It was more the kind of that sense of the music being completely in step with the narrative, the story she was telling.
Did you discover Jocko through Joni Mitchell?
I discovered it through him through a trombone player in a jazz band that I was in. It was like a really trad, like New Orleans jazz band, like 1920s jazz.
Dixieland.
Yeah, so and he would sneak me contraband, which was tapes of interesting stuff, and he gave me one which was his own best of Weather Report with Jacko on one side and Hijira on the other, and I kept forwarding through the Weather Report side to listen to Hijira again, over and over again. So yeah, I mean, it was I'd heard Jacko briefly before that, but that was the point at which I kind of got what he did.
How about your career? How did that get rolling? What kind of stuff were you doing initially?
Well, I screwed up my final exams at school when I was 18 and went to music college. I got in on audition, so I did 2 years at music college, and then hooked up with a Canadian gospel singer that was living in England at the time, and we just started working together. I toured with him for 2 years around Europe, so that was kind of a sort of being thrown in at the deep end with touring and playing and doing all kinds of different things. And when I moved on from that work, I just switched to playing with anybody who would pay me. So I kind of became a session player by default. But all the way through that, I was teaching as well. And not long after I moved, I lived sort of halfway up England when I was working with him. And then I moved back to London, and not long after that, I met the editor of Bassist magazine in a shop and offered to write for them. No, this was a guy called Gibson Keddy. And I met him in a shop and just said, I want to write about gadgets for you. And he said, great, do. So I became the effects and processing guy for the magazine in 97, I guess. So I suddenly had these 3 strings to my bow. I was a writer, a teacher, and a player. And then at the end of 99, when the session part of my career seemed to be going quite well, I landed a solo gig by accident. And I did a solo tune in a set with a band and a promoter.
By accident, does that mean the rest of the band didn't show up?
No, it was that a promoter asked me at the end of a gig where I played this one solo tune with this band. He said, "Oh, have you got a whole set like that?" And I just lied and said yes. And so he booked me for a show, and I kind of came up with half an hour's material and did it. And I had quite a presence online at the time. I think there were very few bass players who had sort of their own websites around the late 90s, and so I had a lot of traffic, and I'd put the recordings of that gig up online, and people went, wow, this is great, where can we hear more? When's the album coming out? And I went, really? Okay. And so I just started working towards that, and also because I'd started talking about playing solo, the phone stopped ringing for session work. People just weren't listening. It was like to my protestations that actually I was happy to play normal bass and do solo stuff. The people who were hiring me were like, no, if you're going to do that, you don't get to play with us.
Well, I wanted to ask about your solo stuff, but you remind me of an interview I did a while back with Juan Alderete. Does he cross your radar? You know who he is?
I know who he is. Yeah, I remember him way back when he was in Racer X.
Right. But he's a total pedal geek. He's what his website has the word pedals in it, pedals and effects or something like that. So how would you describe what you do now with all the gadgets, the pedals, the looping, whatever it is?
Well, the looping side of it is kind of central to it. That I use a rack mount unit called the Looperlative, and that's I think I helped to develop about 10 years ago, which has 8 stereo channels, and I can loop and lay on each of them and route them to different outputs. It's an incredibly rich device. But the processing side of it was largely about exploring what was possible with the instrument. I like the limitation of a bass. I like the fact that I've committed to doing things with just that. That's my voice. But within that limitation, I want to see how far I can push it. So I have a Lexicon processor that's now euphonic, it's non-available, called the MPX G2.
I remember those.
Yeah, and I've squeezed every ounce of mileage out of that. But in the last couple of years, I've shifted back to pedals, mainly because of overdrive. So I'm losing my voice. I've been talking for 2 days solidly in the heat and not drinking enough water. There's a lesson in that. So yeah, I've shifted back towards using pedals as well. So I have the rack. But then in front of the rack, I have a pedal train full of mainly MXR, TC Electronics, Mark Bass and Aguilar pedals. But most of them are overdrives because I like mixing and matching different overdriven sounds.
So what's keeping you busy these days?
I mean, because I play improvised most of the time, I generate a ridiculous amount of recorded work. Because the heart of my rack setup is a Motu sound card. So I can multi-track record every single gig that I do. So every time I do a show with someone and it's a collaborative thing, we've basically got an album at the end of it. And then I can decide whether it's good enough to release or not. But I'm very fortunate that I get to play with some incredible musicians. So I'm generating a huge amount of release quality material. So I've put 3 albums out this year. I've got another 5 kind of being developed at the moment, and they're live recordings that I then just mix and master.
Wow. How about the future? Sounds like you've already accomplished a lot. What else would you like to do that you haven't already accomplished?
Well, I want to do a lot more of the same. There's a refinement process going on, both in terms of the playing and the improvising, and kind of that, just getting that to where I want it to be, but also just other people I'd like to collaborate with. So it's, yeah.
All right, last question, Steve. What would you be if you weren't a bass player? Something outside of music.
I've always said that what I would study is child development, because I'm fascinated by the way that people grow and change. I have a son, he's 4.5, and seeing his relationship with the arts and with science and with language, and seeing how that develops. The thing that always drives me in every pursuit, whether it's as a teacher or as an artist, or I work a lot in social media, it's all curiosity. I'm fascinated by how people work, and so I'd probably do something involving looking at like a child psychologist or something like that, because I'm just fascinated at how we grow and change and become who we are.
It is fascinating. Well, Steve, it's great catching up with you. It is fascinating what you do.
Thank you.
And keep doing what you're doing. Much luck and continued success to you.
Really good to meet you.
In Markneukirchen, Germany, I'm Jon Liebman. You're watching for BassPlayersOnly.com.